Welcome back everyone, it's me Matt. We're talking about tracked vehicles once again, and another quick reminder, if you are new to my channel or been part of my channel for some time, to be notified of any upcoming content, I would strongly encourage you guys to go click on the little bell button by the subscribe button so you can be notified of any upcoming content. So today we are talking about the XM800T, a rather peculiar M113 variant style prototype vehicle that was almost quite interesting to put into real-time service, but quite honestly didn't ever really make the full mark. To understand the history behind the XM800T, we have to go all the way back to the 1950s and the era of classic APCs, or armoured personnel carriers. The Second World War saw a boom in armoured infantry carriers, with virtually every major army deploying them in a fashion or another. The Americans were no exception to this, with their half-tracks. After the war, the half-track APCs evolved over the course of the 1950s and over several tracked APC designs, such as the M59, into one of the most iconic American vehicles of the Cold War, the M113 APC by FMC. The M113 was not exactly armoured in the strictest sense of the word. True to the American battle taxi doctrine was to carry troops to the battlefield and unload them and head back. It only protected its crew and passengers from small arms fire, and anything heavier, such as heavy machine guns or infantry-carried anti-tank weapons, went through it like batter. That wasn't considered, though, as an early problem. After all, the APCs wasn't really supposed to stick around for the fight, but it was one of the factors that led the Americans to revise the battle taxi doctrine, starting from the mid-1960s. Another factor was nuclear warfare. As outlandish as it sounds today, the American and eventually Soviet plans for Europe called for the use of tactical low-yield nuclear weapons, and for the Americans it was considered one of the few viable options to defeat the Soviets, who had massive local superiority in numbers and keeping with an equally large number in Europe that was just simply not economically viable to fight against. As for the Soviets, well, if the Americans were doing it, why not them? This was a problem for the existing APCs. The M113 was not nuclear, biological, or chemically ready, and at the time of delivering a squad of radioactive troops would not have been very good. A mechanized infantry vehicle could stick around, withstand some fire, perhaps even return it with something bigger than a 50 cal was much needed. This line of thought did not come without its drawbacks, however. For one, a standard APC could carry 2 to 3 times as many men as an equally big vehicle with a turret that takes up the space inside. Needless to say, the infantry commanders weren't very happy about that either. And last but not least, the standard APCs were very cheap, and adding turret and optics, however, pushes the cost up considerably. These counter-arguments were only somewhat mitigated later on with the appearance of the BMP-1 in 1966. It looked sleek, it could swim, it could withstand more punishment than the M113, but most importantly, it had a big gun. In reality, the performance of the low-pressure 73mm cannon was far from impressive, but its appearance, along with a sprinkle of propaganda, made it look like every Soviet fighting vehicle would have the firepower of a tank. And then there was the influence of the Vietnam War. For the new mechanized infantry armoured vehicles, the war was both a curse and a blessing. It was a curse in the sense that it was extremely costly. Incredible amounts of taxpayer money were being funneled into this black hole, more often than not at the expense of the other, even promising military programs. It was this war that killed one of the first American attempts at producing a true IFV, the MICV 65s, or the XM01s, although to be fair, the prototype had other issues as well. The blessing, ironically, came in the form of early problematic results for the M113. By the time the M113 actually appeared in Vietnam around 1963, it was practically a brand new vehicle. It only entered service for about 3 years prior, and the battlefield taxi doctrine had yet to be used with it in practice. In reality, it was a disaster with the first users. The ARVN troops disembarking the vehicle without any cover, only to be killed by the waiting North Vietnamese. The M113 was also vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire. Thankfully, the NVA usually lacked a large number of RPG-type weapons, which were very destructive against the thin-skinned M113s. The last but perhaps most serious threat to the M113 was the various mines and other rigged explosives. Anti-tank mines could tear the vehicle apart and kill everyone inside, and even smaller charges could do some serious damage. As a result, the troops later preferred to ride on top of the M113s instead of inside. But the vehicle was never designed to be used this way. It was supposed to be a bailout kind of system. But as usual, the reality of combat differed from the plans laid down in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles away. The desire to ride on top of a vehicle with soldiers telling themselves they could spot threats and bail out instead of waiting inside for what they perceived as a sudden and random death of explosions, heavy machine gun fire, RPG fire, or other threats was only one example of something unforeseen. Years later, the Bradley would at one point be offered with firing ports. While mocked widely in the now classic Pentagon War movie, which by the way I would strongly encourage you to watch, this is where the requirement originated from. The primary objective of the ports wasn't for troops to hit anything outside with their rifles, but to offer them a way to see what's happening outside to combat their anxiety and claustrophobia. Based on these factors, and especially the mentioned previous appearance of the BMP-1, there is a large-scale Soviet infantry modernization program that the US Army decided they needed to revisit, with a Mechanized Infantry Combat Vehicle Program, or MICV, in 1968. The M113 would no longer cut it. It was still in production at that point too, but it wasn't capable of threatening modern Soviet vehicles. This resulted in several considerations starting from 1969. FMC modified one of its M113s to produce an IFV prototype called the XM675. The other vehicle was the XM723, the MICV, or Mechanized Infantry Combat Vehicle. It was bigger, sturdier, and faster than the XM765. Its steel and aluminium or aluminum skin could protect it against Soviet 14.5mm bullets and could go as fast as 72 km an hour. There were problems, however, with its underdeveloped armament which caused further delays. The armament issues weren't the only problem, bringing us finally to the XM800T. In the early 1970s, military project funding was in short supply due to budget cuts, which is why the overseers of the MICV program were not happy to find out in October 1971 that some of their funds were being diverted to the US Army, specifically the Armored Cavalry, a program called the Armored Reconnaissance Scout Vehicle. The idea behind it was to replace the troubled Sheridan, which I have done a video on in the past, and the M114, which was basically just a modified M113 completely unsuitable for its intended scout roles. The replacement had to be fast, stealthy, ideally air-droppable, and Lockheed and FMC were asked to provide their proposals. FMC went for a tracked vehicle, while Lockheed proposed a 6x6 wheel vehicle designated the XM800W. The initial contracts for the 4 prototypes were closed in May 1972, but the number was later reduced to 1 per producer. FMC's prototype for the tracked category was designated the XM800T and was ready in May 1973. Official government testing began in November of that year, and at this point both prototypes had already been given 6,000 miles under their belts. The tracked vehicle actually made quite an impression. It was light and agile, weighing about 8.6 tons, and was powered by a 280 horsepower version of the Detroit diesel 6V53 engine paired with the Allison X200 cross-drive transmission, allowing it to go as fast as 88 km an hour. The power-to-weight ratio was very high for the time too, 32.5 horsepower per ton. While the armour was still thin, it could still withstand 14.5mm bullets, which was requested by the Army. Both the tracked and wheel prototypes shared a turret equipped with advanced optics and electronics such as the Delco day-night sights. The turret was armed with the beautiful, stabilised 20mm Hispano-Suiza HS.820 autocannon, capable of dealing with opponents it was expected to come up against, such as the BMP-1. This weapon was license-produced in the United States under the name of the M139. The fate of this gun in American service is also interesting. With most projects, the gun was actually installed on the turning out as failures or cancelled despite of their qualities. And such was the fate of the XM800T. The trials were very successful, and the design was very promising, beating Lockheed in nearly every aspect of the test. However, with the Vietnam War still raging and sore on someone's minds back in the defense network, money was short, and so were people's patience. The project was in fact so promising that Congress discussed purchasing 3,500 of these vehicles and $141,000 per piece. In April 1974, that number was reduced to 1,447. The decision to cancel the project eventually came from a very up in high of chain of command, officially due to the lack of funding, although it is said that Lockheed, the losing party, also played a role in its lobbyists, which carried a lot of weight in Washington, D.C. The ARSV program was cancelled in November 1974, and the single XM800T prototype was mothballed. It has survived and is still in current running condition. A year later, it was decided to merge the goals of the ARVS program with the goals of the ongoing MICV program, resulting in a development chaos that eventually led to the introduction of the M2 series of infantry fighting vehicles and the M3 series of armoured cavalry of the Bradley fighting vehicle. But that is a story for another video that you are more than welcome to go check out on my channel. Well, that's it for today, folks. Looking at the XM800T, a fascinating little vehicle. Basically a retrofitted M113 with an interesting little turret on top and a reduced influx of troops in the back to allow it to be faster, more nimble, and basically somewhat of a half reconnaissance slash infantry carrier. Honestly, I don't even know. It was very weird design. I know it had good basis, but for the most part, a very strange and peculiar overall concept that really couldn't quite define what it was. Bradley. Thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I would like to thank everyone also from a personal standpoint for financially supporting my channel either via Patreon or subscription-based service. It really does mean so much to me. Thank you everyone also for just stopping by on the video. If you want to be notified of any upcoming videos, click on the little bell by the subscribe button, and you can also go check out all my social media and other links, including my merchandise store, in the description box below. Please leave me a comment of today's video. I'd love to know what you think about it. Hit the like button, and I'll see you on the next one. All the best. Bye bye.